The silence in the observation room felt wrong to Neil Carmichael. Space was supposed to be silent, yes, but this was different. This was the kind of quiet that came before something changed forever. He pressed his palm against the window, watching the massive organic structure floating just beyond the research station. It pulsed with soft blue light, rhythmic and calm, like a heartbeat made visible. "You're really going through with this?" Ruth Okonkwo stood behind him, her reflection visible in the glass. She looked tired. They all did. 3 months of first contact protocols would do that to anyone. Neil didn't turn around. Someone has to. The Unity had arrived without warning, their bioship simply appearing in orbit around the gas giant. No aggression, no demands, just a message delivered in perfect human language through mathematical patterns. "We wish to understand you." That had been 87 days ago. Since then, the research team had learned more about the Unity than humanity had discovered about any alien species in 2 centuries of space exploration. They were old, impossibly old. 10,000 years of recorded history, and their legends spoke of ages before that. They existed as one consciousness spread across thousands of worlds, billions of beings sharing thoughts, instantaneously across distances that should make communication impossible. "The human condition fascinates us," their representative had explained during the first meeting. Representative wasn't quite the right word, though. The Unity didn't have individuals. The being that spoke was simply the closest physical voice, but behind it stood the weight of an entire civilization thinking in unison. "You are fragments, yet you function. You are alone inside your minds, yet you build societies. We cannot comprehend this paradox." So they proposed an exchange, a temporary merging. One human consciousness would link with the Unity through their neural bridge technology, just long enough for them to experience what individuality felt like from the inside. Then they would disconnect, and both species would be richer for the understanding. Ruth had argued against it for weeks. "We don't know what this will do to you," she said now, the same argument wearing thin from repetition. "Their psychology is completely alien. What if your mind can't handle being part of a hive?" "Then you'll pull me out," Neil said simply. He finally turned to face her. "Ruth, this is why we're here. This is what first contact means. Someone has to take the risk." She shook her head but said nothing more. They both knew he was right, and they both knew he had other reasons for volunteering. His file mentioned a wife dead for 6 years. No children. No close family. He'd requested deep space assignments exclusively since then. Always the furthest stations, the longest tours. Running away was easier than dealing with the empty spaces in his life. Maybe that's why the Unity interested him so much. They never had to deal with loneliness. The preparation room was sterile and cold. Neil lay down on the interface table while technicians attached monitoring equipment to his head, chest, and arms. Through the observation window, he could see Ruth and the rest of the team watching, recording, ready to intervene if something went wrong. The Unity representative entered through a separate door. It looked vaguely humanoid, because the Unity had shaped this particular body for human comfort, but the resemblance was superficial. Its skin shimmered with the same bioluminescence as their ships, and its eyes held depths that suggested far more than one mind looking out. "Are you prepared, Neil Carmichael?" it asked. "As much as I can be." The representative moved to the head of the table, and the ceiling above Neil opened. Crystalline tendrils descended, beautiful and terrible, catching the light like fiber optics filled with living stars. They moved with purpose, positioning themselves around Neil's head without quite touching him yet. "There will be some discomfort at first," the Unity said. "Your mind will resist the connection. This is natural. Try to relax and accept the merge." Neil closed his eyes and tried to slow his breathing. He heard Ruth's voice through the intercom, counting down from 10. Somewhere around 7, the tendrils touched his skin. The pain was immediate and absolute. Every nerve in his body screamed as the bridge forced its way through his skull, not breaking bone but phasing through it, rewriting the rules of what his cells could do. Neil tried to scream but couldn't remember how to control his lungs. Then the pain vanished, replaced by something infinitely stranger. He could feel them, all of them. Billions of minds pressed against his consciousness like an ocean against a single grain of sand. He was drowning in thoughts that weren't his own. Memories from 1,000 different worlds, emotions he had no names for. A scientist on a planet orbiting a red dwarf star was analyzing soil samples. And Neil knew the exact mineral composition because the scientist knew it. And the Unity knew it, and now Neil was part of that knowing. A farmer was harvesting crops on a world with 3 moons. And Neil could taste the satisfaction of a job well done, could feel the ache in muscles that weren't his, could sense the presence of billions of other Unity members doing billions of other tasks. All connected, all one. It was beautiful. It was perfect. It was everything loneliness wasn't. For a moment, Neil understood why the Unity had stayed merged for 10,000 years. Why would anyone choose to be alone when they could be part of this infinite harmony? But then something shifted. His memories began to surface unbidden and unwelcome. The hospital room where his wife died. The funeral he attended alone. The empty apartment he'd sold before leaving Earth. The years of silence, of choosing isolation over the risk of more loss. These were private thoughts. Personal pain. They belonged to him and him alone, except now they didn't. Now they were flowing into the Unity, and he could feel the collective consciousness examining them, trying to process them, unable to understand why he would hold on to suffering instead of sharing it, and letting the collective dilute it across billions of minds. The Unity recoiled from his grief, and in that recoil Neil felt something terrible happen. A crack. Tiny at first, like ice beginning to break on a frozen lake. The Unity's perfect harmony stuttered, missed a beat, and in that gap, individual voices began to emerge. The scientists suddenly felt alone with their soil samples and didn't understand why. The farmer stopped mid-harvest, confused by the sudden silence where the collective's presence used to be. Neil tried to pull back, tried to disconnect, but the bridge held firm. His individual consciousness was spreading through the Unity like a virus, and everywhere it touched, the hive mind fractured. Beings who had never known solitude suddenly experienced it. Minds that had always been part of a greater whole suddenly found themselves isolated, trapped in their own heads with only their own thoughts for company. The screaming started. Billions of voices no longer harmonized, each one terrified and alone. Neil screamed with them, his voice lost in the chorus of a civilization coming apart at the seams. The last thing he remembered before darkness took him was Ruth's voice. Distant and desperate, shouting orders to cut the connection. But by then it was far too late. The damage was already done. Darkness pressed against the view screen like something alive and hungry. Ruth stared at the display showing Unity space, watching as star systems went dark one by one. Communication relays that had pulsed with constant bioluminescent chatter for millennia simply stopped. The silence spreading across the galaxy was the silence of something dying. "How long has he been unconscious?" she asked, not looking away from the darkening map. 4 hours and 16 minutes, Peter Walsh answered from the medical station. He was young, too young for a crisis like this, and his hands shook as he adjusted Neil's vital signs monitor. His brain activity is off the charts. It's like he's dreaming 1,000 dreams at once. Ruth finally turned away from the view screen and moved to Neil's bedside. The crystalline tendrils were still embedded in his skull, fused so completely with his nervous system that removing them would kill him. They pulsed with erratic light. No longer the calm blue of the Unity, but a chaotic rainbow of conflicting signals. Blood had dried beneath his nose and ears, the price his body paid for having billions of voices forced through a mind meant for one. "We need to get him out of there," Peter said. "Whatever's happening, it's tearing him apart. And what happens to them if we do?" Ruth gestured at the view screen. "We've received fragmentary transmissions from Unity worlds. They're not connected anymore. The hive mind is gone, and they don't know how to function without it." She pulled up one of the recorded messages. The image was shaky, transmitted from a Unity colony world. The being on screen looked lost, its luminescent skin flickering in patterns that suggested distress. When it spoke, its voice carried none of the collective's usual certainty. "Help us, please. The silence is... I cannot..." The being touched its own chest as if discovering it for the first time. "I am alone. We are all alone. What is this? What has happened to us?" The message cut off abruptly. They'd received hundreds like it in the past 4 hours. Some were pleas for help. Others were accusations blaming humanity for destroying 10,000 years of peace. A few were simply screams. Ruth closed the playback and looked at Neil's unconscious form. He's trapped between both states. Part of him is still connected to the Unity, experiencing what they're experiencing. Every one of them. That's billions of conscious beings, Peter whispered. How is he not brain dead? I don't know. Maybe because he caused it, he's somehow immune to the worst effects. Or maybe he's dying slowly and we just can't tell yet. An alarm blared across the station. Ruth ran to the command console, already knowing what she would find. Unity ships were approaching, dozens of them. Their biohulls no longer pulsing in synchronized patterns but flickering with the same chaotic light as the tendrils in Neil's head. They're hailing us, Peter called out. Audio only. Put it through. The voice that came through the speakers was wrong. It spoke with the Unity's usual multiple harmonics, but the tones clashed against each other, creating painful dissonance. You have broken us. You have taken the song and shattered it into noise. Return what you have stolen. Ruth keyed her own microphone. We didn't mean for this to happen. It was supposed to be a temporary connection, an exchange of understanding. Understanding? The voice laughed, and the sound was madness. Multiple voices trying to laugh at once, none of them quite synchronized. We understand now. We understand loneliness. We understand fear. We understand what it means to be trapped in a single mind with no one to share the burden. We understand hell. Let us help you, Ruth said, trying to keep her voice calm. We can work together to fix this. Fix? The word came out as a snarl. You think this can be fixed? We have forgotten how to be individuals. We never learned because we never needed to. For 10,000 years we were one. Now we are billions, and each of us is drowning in the silence where the collective used to be. The lead Unity ship moved closer, its weapons ports opening. Ruth recognized the gesture. They were preparing to fire. We want the human, the voice demanded. We want Neil Carmichael. His mind holds the pattern of the break. We will study it. We will reverse it. We will be whole again, no matter what it costs. Ruth looked at Neil, still unconscious, still trapped between states. She knew what she should do. Surrender him, save the station, save her crew, prevent a war between humanity and a desperate, fragmenting alien civilization. It was the logical choice, but she also knew what they would do to him. They would tear his mind apart looking for answers, dissect his consciousness while he was still aware, keep him alive and suffering for as long as it took to understand how to rebuild their hive. I need time to consider, she said. You have one rotation of your planet Earth. The voice replied. Then we will take him by force. And we will take your research, and we will take anything else we need to restore what you have stolen from us. The communication cut off. The Unity ships remained in position, surrounding the station like predators waiting for wounded prey to weaken. Peter was staring at her. What are we going to do? Ruth pulled up the emergency protocols on her console. We're going to evacuate everyone we can. Get people to the escape pods. I want them launched and heading for the nearest human outpost within the hour. And Neil? Neil stays with me. She met Peter's eyes. I won't hand him over to be tortured, and I won't leave him alone. Everyone else gets out. That's an order. The next hour passed in controlled chaos. Crew members gathered essential data, packed emergency supplies loaded into escape pods. Some argued about leaving, but Ruth's authority held firm. By the time the last pod launched, only 3 people remained on the station. Ruth, Neil, and a communications officer named David Chen who refused to abandon his post. They watched the escape pods accelerate away from the station, hoping the Unity ships would let them pass. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the Unity vessels opened fire. 3 escape pods evaporated in bursts of organic weapon fire before Ruth could even scream. The rest scattered, their pilots abandoning formation and fleeing in all directions. The Unity ships let them go, their point made. They could kill humans whenever they wanted, and mercy was no longer guaranteed. Ruth collapsed into her chair, hands shaking. Peter and 19 others were dead, vaporized, gone. Because she'd made the wrong choice, because Neil had volunteered. Because humanity had reached out to touch something it didn't understand. Incoming transmission, David said quietly. It's different from before. Different ship, different voice. Ruth nodded, not trusting herself to speak. This voice was softer, uncertain. Dr. Okonkwo, my name is... I have chosen to call myself Lyris. I know you have no reason to trust any of us right now, but please listen. Not all of us want to hurt you. Not all of us want to go back to what we were. Who are you? Ruth managed to ask. I was part of the Unity's research cast. I spent millennia studying alien species as part of the collective. Now I am just me, just Lyris, and I am terrified, Dr. Okonkwo. I am more frightened than I have ever been. But I am also something I have never been before. What's that? Curious. Not because the collective directs my curiosity, but because I choose to be curious. I'm thinking my own thoughts, making my own observations, forming my own conclusions. It is painful and isolating and wonderful, and I do not want to lose it. Ruth felt a spark of hope. There are others like you? Some, not many. Most of our kind are demanding reunion at any cost. They cannot bear the silence. But a few of us are adapting. We are learning what your Neil Carmichael already knew, how to exist as individuals. Can you help him? There was a pause. I do not know, but I know someone who might. If you can keep him alive for one more day, I will bring help. I promise you. The transmission ended. Ruth looked at Neil, still caught between worlds, still suffering. One more day seemed impossible, but impossible was all they had left. Rain fell on Unity Prime for the first time in recorded history. The weather control systems that had maintained perfect environmental conditions for millennia had failed when the collective consciousness collapsed. Now clouds gathered and dispersed at random, and water poured from the sky without purpose or pattern. Millions of Unity beings stood in the streets, looking up at the rain, feeling it touch their skin, unable to share the sensation with anyone else. One of them, who had once been designated Warrior Caste 792, stood guard outside a holding facility and tried to remember why it mattered. The collective had assigned it to protection duty. It had defended Unity interests for 3,000 years without question, because the collective's purpose was its purpose. But now the collective was silent, and the warrior didn't know why it should continue following orders that no one had given. Except something inside it, something new and fragile, whispered that duty still mattered, even without the collective telling it so. The warrior didn't understand this feeling, but it stayed at its post anyway, watching the rain and wondering if this was what humans called choice. Inside the facility, Neil opened his eyes for the first time in 3 days. The world came into focus slowly, painfully. He was in a different place now, a Unity structure rather than the human research station. The walls were organic, pulsing weakly with light. The ceiling curved overhead like the inside of a massive ribcage. You are awake. The voice came from beside him. A Unity being sat in a chair that looked like it had grown from the floor. Its bioluminescent patterns flickered with uncertainty. Good. I was beginning to fear you would remain unconscious until we dissected you. Neil tried to sit up and failed. His body felt distant, disconnected. Where am I? Unity Prime, the central world of our civilization. Or what remains of it. The being leaned forward. I am called First Voice now. I was the primary speaking vessel for the collective. Now I am simply on myself, and I find that I hate being myself. I'm sorry, Neil whispered. I didn't mean for this to happen. Your intentions are irrelevant. The result is what matters. First Voice stood and began pacing. Do you know what we have lost? 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge shared instantly across billions of minds. 10,000 years of perfect cooperation, of building wonders that individual consciousness could never achieve. 10,000 years of never being alone. Neil closed his eyes. He could still feel echoes of the connection. Fragments of thoughts that weren't his own bleeding through the damaged neural bridge. Where's Ruth? The woman who was with me? She fought to protect you when we came for you. She killed 3 of our soldiers before we subdued her. First Voice's patterns shifted to something that might have been respect. We did not kill her. Some part of me, some new and unwelcome part, admired her loyalty. She is being held elsewhere in this facility. Let her go. She had nothing to do with this. No one will be let go until you fix what you have broken. First Voice moved closer, and Neil could see something desperate in its eyes. You will restore the collective. You will show us how to merge again. Your mind has the pattern, the template. We will extract it from you regardless of what it costs you. I don't know how, Neil said. It wasn't intentional. I don't understand what happened any better than you do. Then you will learn. We will give you access to our best researchers, our finest technology. We will probe your mind and dissect your consciousness layer by layer until we understand. And if you die in the process, at least you will have died trying to repair the damage you caused. First Voice turned to leave, then paused at the door. I had a name once before the merging. Did you know that? 4 million years ago, my species had individuals. We had families and conflicts and art. We gave all of that up to become the Unity. We thought we were evolving beyond the petty limitations of singular consciousness. The being's patterns dimmed. Now I remember what we lost, and I do not know if the trade was worth it. After First Voice left, Neil lay in the dim light and listened to his own breathing. Each breath felt loud in the silence. He tried to access the connection, to reach out to the unity through the damaged neural bridge, but found only fragments, scattered voices, isolated and afraid. A farming overseer who had managed crop production across 12 worlds now stood alone in a field, unable to remember why the planting schedule mattered. A nursery tender who had cared for developing Unity young as part of a collective nurturing effort now looked at the children in its care and felt overwhelmed by individual responsibility. A deep space navigator who had guided ships through the void with the certainty of collective knowledge now sat paralyzed in a ship's command center, terrified of making a wrong decision. But there were other voices too. Quieter, more tentative, but growing stronger. An artist who had contributed to collective aesthetic projects now created something entirely its own and felt pride for the first time. A philosopher who had pondered questions as part of the collective whole now formed a theory that contradicted everything the Unity believed and felt exhilarated by the heresy. A musician who had played perfect harmonies for millennia now experimented with discord and found it beautiful. Neil realized he was witnessing the birth of a civilization. Not its death, but its transformation into something new. The question was whether the old Unity would destroy itself before the new one could emerge. The door to his cell opened again, but this time it wasn't First Voice. A smaller Unity being entered, moving carefully, looking around as if afraid of being followed. Its patterns flickered in what Neil had learned to recognize as nervousness. "You are Neil Carmichael," it said quietly. "I am Lyris. I spoke with Dr. Okonkwo before the attack on your station. I promised I would bring help." "What kind of help?" "Understanding. Context. Knowledge that First Voice and the purists refused to acknowledge." Lyris moved closer, producing a small device that looked like crystallized starlight. "I have been researching human history since the separation. Your species struggled with consciousness too, did you know? Your philosophers spent millennia debating the meaning of individual existence. Your psychologists studied loneliness and connection. Your poets wrote about isolation and community." Neil tried to focus on the device. "What is that?" "Data, human data. Philosophy, psychology, literature. Everything I could gather about how your kind learned to be individuals without going mad from loneliness." Lyris pressed the device into Neil's hand. "First Voice wants to force us back into the collective. But I think there is another way. I think we can learn to be individuals like you learned. We just need teachers." "I'm not a teacher," Neil said. "I'm just a scientist who made a terrible mistake." "You are a human who chose to live alone rather than risk the pain of connection," Lyris said gently. "You understand isolation. You understand what it means to be trapped in your own mind. That makes you exactly the teacher we need." Before Neil could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Lyris's patterns shifted to alarm. "They know I'm here, I must go. But remember, Neil Carmichael, not all of us want to return to what we were. Some of us want to learn how to be what we are becoming." Lyris fled, leaving Neil alone with the device and a growing realization. He wasn't just a prisoner waiting to be dissected. He was a living bridge between two states of consciousness, and both sides needed him for different reasons. First Voice wanted him to restore the past. Lyris wanted him to help build the future. Outside his cell, the warrior who had once been Warrior Cast 792 listened to the alarms and made a choice. It would protect the human, not because the collective commanded it, but because something in the human story resonated with the warrior's own confused awakening. It would protect Neil until it understood what this new existence meant. It would protect him, even if that meant fighting against its own kind. 3 moons hung in the sky above the burning city. Neil watched them through a viewport while Unity soldiers fought in the streets below, their weapon fire painting the darkness in colors that had no human names. The Civil War had started 18 hours ago, when the awakened faction publicly refused First Voice's order to surrender for forced remerging. Now Unity Prime was tearing itself apart. The warrior stood beside him, silent and still. It had told Neil to call it Guardian, the first name it had chosen for itself. Guardian had killed 2 purist soldiers who came to take Neil for dissection, then carried him through the facility to this observation tower, while chaos erupted around them. "Why are you helping me?" Neil asked. Guardian's patterns shifted through colors Neil was learning to read as contemplation. I killed 17 beings during my service to the collective. I remember each one now. Their faces, their final moments. The collective made me do it, and I felt nothing because the collective felt it was necessary. Guardian touched the weapon at its side. Now I feel everything. Guilt, horror, shame. These emotions are new to me and they are painful. But they are mine. That doesn't explain why you're protecting me. You gave me these feelings. You broke the collective and forced me to become an individual. I hated you for it. Guardian's patterns brightened. But I also realized something. If I can feel guilt for what I did, I can choose not to do those things anymore. I can decide what kind of being I want to be. The collective never gave me that choice. An explosion rocked the tower. Below, a building collapsed in a cascade of organic material and crystalline structures. Unity beings fled in all directions, some fighting, some simply trying to survive. This is my fault, Neil said. Yes, Guardian agreed. But fault is not the same as responsibility. You caused the separation, but we are responsible for what we do with our new existence. Some of us choose violence. Some of us choose adaptation. You cannot control which we choose. The door to the observation room burst open. Ruth stumbled in, followed by Lyris and 3 other Unity beings Neil didn't recognize. Ruth's face was bruised, her arm in a makeshift sling, but her eyes lit up when she saw him. Neil, thank God you're alive. She crossed the room and grabbed his hand. We need to get out of here. The whole city is falling apart. We cannot leave yet, Lyris interrupted. First Voice has activated the reunion protocol. If we do not stop it, millions will die. Neil turned to Lyris. What's the reunion protocol? One of the other Unity beings answered, its patterns flickering with fear. It is an ancient failsafe. If the collective is ever damaged beyond repair, designated vessels are authorized to force a remerging using neural override technology. It does not matter if individuals consent. The technology rewrites their brain patterns and pulls them back into a hive mind. That's not possible, Ruth said. You can't force consciousness to merge like that. The Unity has had 10,000 years to perfect the technology, Lyris said quietly. It is possible, but the process is traumatic. Many will not survive it, and those who do survive will lose everything they have become since the separation. Every thought, every choice, every fragment of individual identity will be erased. Guardian's patterns shifted to rage. This is genocide. First Voice would kill the individuals we have become to resurrect the collective we used to be. How do we stop it? Neil asked. Lyris produced a holographic display from a device on its arm. The image showed a massive structure at the center of Unity Prime, a tower that reached into the clouds. The reunion protocol is controlled from the central nexus. First Voice and the purest leaders are there now, preparing to activate it. We must reach them before they complete the sequence. And do what? Ruth demanded. We're 2 humans and a handful of Unity rebels against an entire faction of your people. We convince them, Lyris said. We show them there is another way. They won't listen, Guardian said. The purists are desperate. They would rather die than remain individuals. Neil looked at the device Lyris had given him earlier, the one filled with human knowledge about consciousness and individuality. An idea began forming in his mind, dangerous and possibly futile, but the only option he could see. What if we gave them a choice, he said. Not forced reunion or forced individuality, but actual choice. Let each Unity being decide for themselves whether to merge or remain separate. The technology does not work that way, one of Lyris's companions said. The neural bridge requires unanimous participation. If even one consciousness resists, the entire merge fails. Then we change the technology, Neil said. We modify it to allow voluntary, temporary merging. Small groups who want to connect can do so, while those who want to stay individual can remain separate. Create a spectrum instead of forcing everyone to one extreme or the other. Lyris's patterns brightened with excitement. That could work. The fundamental technology exists. We would just need to modify the parameters, create safeguards for individual withdrawal, establish protocols for consent. How long would that take? Ruth asked. Longer than we have, Guardian said. First Voice will activate the reunion protocol within hours. We do not have time for theoretical modifications. Neil stood, steadying himself against the viewport. His body still felt wrong. The neural bridge still fused to his nervous system, but he could function. He had to function. Then we go to the central nexus, he said. We confront First Voice directly. and we hope we can make them understand before they destroy everything their civilization is becoming. The journey through Unity Prime was a nightmare of violence and chaos. Guardian led them through service tunnels beneath the city, avoiding the worst of the fighting, but they still encountered Purist patrols twice. Guardian killed efficiently and without hesitation, while Lyris and the other Awakened used non-lethal stunning weapons. Ruth stayed close to Neil, her good arm supporting him when his strength faltered. "I'm sorry," Neil said during a quiet moment, hiding from a passing patrol. "I'm sorry I dragged you into this." "You didn't drag me anywhere," Ruth replied. "I came because someone needed to keep you from doing something stupid." "Looks like I failed at that." Despite everything, Neil almost smiled. "You came because you're a better person than I am. You could have evacuated with the others. And let you face this alone? Not a chance." She squeezed his hand. "Besides, someone needs to document this for the history books. First contact with a hive mind that we accidentally destroyed. This is going to be quite the report." They reached the central nexus as the suns began to set. The tower loomed above them, its organic surface crawling with Purist guards. At the top, visible through transparent sections of the structure, First Voice stood before a massive neural interface. The reunion protocol was ready to activate. "We will never fight through those defenses," Guardian said. Lyris's patterns flickered with determination. "Then we will not fight. We will talk. Neil Carmichael, you must convince First Voice that there is another way. You are human. You understand both individual consciousness and the desire for connection. If anyone can bridge the gap between Purists and Awakened, it is you." Neil looked up at the tower and felt the weight of billions of lives resting on his shoulders. He was a scientist, not a diplomat. He'd spent years running away from connection, hiding in the silence of space. What made anyone think he could convince an alien civilization to choose a middle path when he'd never been able to find balance in his own life? But Ruth was here. Lyris was here. Guardian had chosen to protect him despite having every reason to hate him. Maybe that meant something. "All right," he said. "Let's go talk to First Voice." The chamber at the top of the central nexus was vast enough to hold thousands, but only a few dozen Unity beings occupied it now. Purist leaders stood in a circle around the neural interface, their patterns synchronized in a way that reminded Neil painfully of the collective he'd destroyed. First Voice stood at the center, hands hovering over the activation controls. The guards didn't stop Neil's group from entering. Perhaps they recognized Lyris and Guardian. Perhaps they were too focused on the impending activation. Or perhaps, Neil thought, they wanted witnesses to what came next. First Voice turned as they approached. Its patterns showed no surprise, only a tired resignation. "You should not be here, Neil Carmichael. This does not concern you anymore. You have already done enough damage. I'm here to ask you not to do this," Neil said. His voice echoed in the chamber's strange acoustics. "Don't force them back. Don't erase what they've become. What they have become?" First Voice's patterns flared with anger. "They have become lost, broken, alone. Do you know how many Unity beings have ended their own lives since the separation? 17 million and counting. They could not bear the isolation, the silence where the collective used to be. Every day the number grows. The weight of those deaths hit Neil like a physical blow. 17 million, dead because of what he'd done, because he'd reached out to touch something he didn't understand. "I know," he whispered. "I know, and I'm sorry. But killing the ones who want to stay individual won't bring those 17 million back. No, but it will prevent 17 billion more deaths." First Voice moved closer to the controls. "The Unity is dying, Neil Carmichael. Our civilization is collapsing. Infrastructure fails because individuals cannot coordinate like the collective could. Children go unfed because their caretakers are paralyzed by individual responsibility. Ships drift in space because their navigators are afraid to make decisions alone. We are watching our entire society crumble because you gave us a gift we never asked for and cannot handle." Lyris stepped forward. "That is not entirely true, First Voice. Some of us are adapting. Some of us are learning to function as individuals. Some," First Voice agreed. "A tiny fraction. The rest are suffering or dying. Tell me, Lyris, is your individual curiosity worth the lives of billions?" Lyris's patterns dimmed, and Neil saw the doubt there. The weight of the question was crushing. How could individual freedom be worth that much death? But Ruth spoke up, her voice cutting through the chamber. "When humanity developed agriculture, Millions starved during the transition from hunter-gatherer societies. When we industrialized, millions more died in factories and mines. When we reached for space, we lost thousands in accidents and failures. Every major evolution in consciousness, in society, and capability came with a cost. She looked directly at First Voice. The question isn't whether the cost exists. It's whether you allow your people the choice to pay it. Humans are not unity, First Voice said. You evolved as individuals. You had millions of years to develop psychological frameworks for isolation. We had 10,000 years as a collective, and before that we have no memory. We do not know how to be individuals because we erased that knowledge when we merged. That's not true, Guardian said quietly. Everyone turned to look at the warrior. I accessed the archives during my escape with Neil Carmichael. The deep archives, the ones sealed before the Great Merging. First Voice, you lied to us. The unity was not always collective. First Voice's patterns froze, which Neil had learned meant shock or fear. You should not have accessed those files. But I did. And I learned the truth. Guardian moved to the center of the chamber, facing the purest leaders. 4 million years ago, our species was individual. We had names, families, nations. We created art and philosophy as individuals. We competed and cooperated and struggled with meaning, just like humans do now. Then something threatened us, Lyris added, understanding dawning in its patterns, something so terrible that we chose to merge our consciousnesses to survive it. The collective was not our natural state. It was a desperate solution to an existential crisis. First Voice's patterns dimmed. Yes, the archives speak of an enemy, a force that nearly destroyed us. We merged to pool our resources, our intelligence, our strength. We became the unity to survive. And we won. We defeated the enemy and saved our species. But the enemy is gone, Neil said. Whatever it was, it's been gone for millions of years. You stayed merged because you forgot you ever chose to merge. You made the collective your identity instead of your tool. And now you have taken our tool away, First Voice said. You have forced us back to our original state, and we do not remember how to live this way. Neil pulled out the device Lyris had given him, the one filled with human knowledge. Then learn. Not by erasing what you've become, but by studying how consciousness works. Humans have been dealing with these questions for our entire existence. We've developed philosophy, psychology, therapy, community structures, art, religion, all to help us cope with individual consciousness. We can teach you. In exchange for what? One of the other purist leaders asked. What does humanity gain from helping us? Understanding, Ruth said. You wanted to know how humans function as individuals. Now you have the perfect opportunity to learn. We'll teach you what we know about consciousness, and you'll teach us what you learned as a collective. Both our species will be richer for it. First Voice looked at the activation controls, then back at Neil. And if we refuse? If we activate the reunion protocol and restore the collective? Then you'll have peace, Neil admitted. But you'll also have stagnation. The collective was stable, but it didn't grow. You said it yourself. 10,000 years of history, and what did you accomplish in that time? You maintained, you preserved, but you didn't evolve. We were content, First Voice said. Were you? Lyris asked. Is that why you reached out to humanity? Because you were content? Or did some part of the collective recognize that something was missing? Some spark of curiosity that could only come from individual consciousness? First Voice's patterns flickered through rapid changes, cycling through emotions Neil couldn't name. Finally it spoke. I do not know anymore. I am one voice now, not the collective whole. I cannot speak for billions. Then don't, Neil said. Let them speak for themselves. Modify the reunion protocol. Make it voluntary. Let each unity being choose whether to merge or stay individual or find some middle ground. Trust your people to make their own decisions. That is impossible. The neural technology requires unanimous participation. Then change the technology, Lyris said, echoing Neil's earlier suggestion. We have the finest scientists in the galaxy. We can modify the neural bridge to allow voluntary temporary merging, small collectives instead of one massive hive. Individuals can join groups for support and connection, then separate when they need solitude. Create a spectrum of consciousness instead of forcing everyone to one extreme. First Voice was silent for a long moment. Outside the chamber, the sounds of fighting continued. The city burned. Unity beings killed each other over the question of consciousness while their leaders stood in this room and debated philosophy. Finally, First Voice spoke. If we do this, if we allow choice, it will take time. Months, perhaps years, to develop the technology. Many will die while we work. Many will die no matter what you choose, Guardian said. At least this way they die having made their own choices about how to live. First Voice looked at each of them in turn. Neil could see the being wrestling with itself. Individual consciousness fighting against the ingrained habit of collective thinking. This was the first real choice First Voice had made as an individual, and the weight of it was crushing. Very well, First Voice said finally. We will attempt your middle path. We will modify the reunion protocol to allow voluntary association. We will give each unity being the choice of how they wish to exist. Its patterns brightened with something that might have been hope, or might have been fear, and we will pray to whatever forces govern the universe that we are not making a terrible mistake. The purist leaders protested, but First Voice overrode them. No. We have been debating this among ourselves, making decisions for billions of beings who cannot speak for themselves. No more. If we are to be individuals, we must act like individuals, and individuals deserve the right to choose their own path. First Voice turned to Neil. You will help us develop this technology. Your human knowledge of consciousness, combined with our understanding of neural interfaces, may create something neither species could achieve alone. Neil nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. I'll do everything I can. And we will help as well, Lyra said, gesturing to the other awakened. We have been studying human philosophy and psychology. We can serve as bridges between unity and human thinking. First Voice deactivated the reunion protocol, and Neil heard sighs of relief echo through the chamber. The immediate crisis was averted, but the real work was just beginning. 5 years had changed Unity Prime beyond recognition. Neil stood in the public garden that had been constructed where the central nexus once dominated the skyline. The tower was gone now, dismantled and repurposed into smaller community centers scattered throughout the city. Around him, Unity beings walked alone in pairs and small groups. Some glowed with the synchronized patterns that indicated temporary merging. Others maintained individual patterns, their lights flickering with unique thoughts. Flowers grew in the garden now, actual flowers, cultivated because individual Unity beings decided they enjoyed the aesthetic. The concept of enjoying something for its own sake, without collective approval or purpose, was still relatively new to them. But they were learning. You're looking contemplative, Ruth said, walking up beside him. She moved with a slight limp now, a permanent reminder of injuries sustained during the Civil War. She'd refused regenerative treatment, saying the scar helped her remember the cost of what they'd accomplished here. Just thinking about how far they've come, Neil said. 5 years ago, I thought I'd destroyed an entire civilization. Now look at them. A group of young Unity beings ran past, chasing each other in a game that seemed to have no rules. They laughed with sounds their vocal cords hadn't been designed to make but had adapted to produce. Behind them, an adult Unity being watched with what could only be described as parental concern, its patterns cycling through worry and affection. The death toll finally stopped rising last month, Ruth said quietly. 23 million total. 23 million Unity beings who couldn't adapt to individual consciousness. Neil closed his eyes. I know I'll carry that number for the rest of my life. But the birth rate is up, Ruth continued. Real births, individuals choosing to procreate because they want children of their own, not because the collective assigned them to reproduction duty. The population is stabilizing. They're going to survive this. Different than they were. Though, everything that survives changes. Ruth looked up at the sky, where Unity ships moved in patterns that were coordinated, but not perfectly synchronized. The question was never whether they'd stay the same. It was whether they'd find a way to be different without destroying themselves. A soft chime from Neil's communication device interrupted them. He checked the display and smiled. Lyris is ready for the presentation. Want to come watch? They walked through the garden to an amphitheater that had been carved from living stone. Thousands of Unity beings filled the seats, more watching through remote viewing systems. On the central stage, Lyris stood before a holographic display, its patterns bright with excitement and nervousness. Thank you all for coming, Lyris began. Its voice amplified across the amphitheater. 5 years ago, I was part of a collective consciousness. I had no individual identity, no personal goals, no unique perspective. Today I stand before you as myself, as Lyris, and I want to share what I've learned. The holographic display showed images from Lyris's research, unity beings in various states of consciousness, from fully individual to temporarily merged in groups of varying sizes. Charts track their psychological well-being, productivity, creative output, social connections. What we've discovered, Lyris continued, is that consciousness exists on a spectrum. Some of us thrive in temporary collectives, merging for specific tasks or for emotional support, then separating when we need solitude. Others prefer to remain individual, connecting through traditional communication rather than neural links. And some fluctuate, joining and leaving collective states based on their needs at the time. An elderly unity being in the front row raised a hand, but we have lost the perfect unity we once had. We can no longer pool our resources as efficiently. Is this truly progress? We have lost perfect efficiency, Lyris agreed. But we have gained something the collective never had: innovation. In 5 years of individual consciousness, we have produced more new art, more novel scientific theories, more unique philosophical perspectives than in the previous 1,000 years of collective existence. We have conflict now, yes, but we also have genuine creativity. The elderly being considered this, its patterns thoughtful. I miss the collective. The silence is sometimes overwhelming. Then join a voluntary merge, Lyris said gently. That is your choice to make. No one will force you to remain individual if you find it unbearable. The presentation continued for another hour. Lyris showed recordings of temporary collectives working together, their minds linked for specific purposes, then separating. A group of engineers who merged to design a new propulsion system, their combined intelligence producing breakthroughs, then separated to pursue individual interests. A support network of beings who had lost loved ones in the Civil War, merging periodically to share grief and comfort, then returning to individual consciousness when the pain became manageable. After the presentation ended, Neil and Ruth found Lyris in a quiet corner of the amphitheater. The researcher was surrounded by other Unity beings asking questions, debating points, challenging conclusions. Lyris engaged with each one individually, something that would have been impossible when every being shared the same thoughts. That was beautiful, Neil said when the crowd finally dispersed. You've come so far. Lyris's patterns showed pleasure at the compliment. I learned from the best teacher. Humanity has been struggling with these questions for your entire existence. You showed us it was possible to be individual without being alone. We also showed you it's possible to be individual and still be isolated, Neil said, thinking of his own years of self-imposed exile. That's a lesson I had to relearn myself. Yes, Lyris agreed. Which brings me to something I wish to discuss with you. I have been communicating with human psychologists about trauma and recovery. They suggested that you might benefit from addressing your own isolation. When did you last speak with your daughter? Neil tensed. I don't have a daughter. You do, Lyris said gently. Sarah Carmichael, age 32, living on Earth. You have not spoken to her since your wife died 6 years ago. The human psychologists say this is called avoidance behavior. You ran from connection because connection caused you pain. That's not your business, Neil said sharply. Perhaps not, but you taught me that individual consciousness means caring about the well-being of other individuals, even when they do not ask for such care. You are lonely, Neil Carmichael. You have been lonely for years, and now that the unity crisis is stabilizing, you have time to address your own healing. Ruth touched Neil's arm. She's right. I've been telling you the same thing for months. Your daughter has been trying to reach you. She sent 17 messages while we've been here. You haven't answered any of them. Neil pulled away, his chest tight. I don't know what to say to her. I left. I ran away after her mother died and buried myself in work. What kind of father does that? A father who was in pain, Lyris said. A father who did not know how to process grief as an individual, so he tried to escape it. The unity beings who could not adapt to individual consciousness did the same thing. They ended their lives rather than learn to cope with difficult emotions. But you survived, and now you have the opportunity to rebuild the connections you ran from. Guardian approached from across the amphitheater. The warrior had become head of security for the new unity government, a position it took seriously. Its patterns showed concern as it joined the group. I have news, Guardian said. The last purist holdouts have agreed to a ceasefire. They will not attempt another forced merging. They have chosen instead to form their own voluntary collective, separate from the rest of Unity society. They will live as they wish in permanent connection, and the rest of us will live as we wish. That's incredible, Ruth said. How did you convince them? I did not convince them. They convinced themselves. Guardian's pattern shifted to something like amusement. They tried to live as individuals for 5 years, hated every moment of it, and decided that their happiness mattered more than forcing others to share their preference. They learned to respect individual choice by experiencing it themselves. Neil felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The Civil War was truly over. The Unity had found a way to coexist across their spectrum of consciousness. They would survive, different than before, but perhaps stronger for their diversity. I should return to Earth, he said quietly. The Unity doesn't need me anymore. You've learned how to be individuals. You've developed your own frameworks for consciousness. My work here is done. Your work as a teacher is done, Lyris agreed. But your work as a healer is just beginning. Go home, Neil Carmichael. Talk to your daughter. Learn to be connected again. Show us that the bridge between isolation and connection works both ways. The journey back to Earth took 3 months. Neil spent most of it drafting and deleting messages to Sarah, trying to find words for 6 years of silence. Nothing felt adequate. How do you apologize for abandoning your child when she needed you? How do you explain that you were so afraid of losing another person you loved, that you ran from the one person who needed you most? In the end, he sent a simple message. I'm coming home. I'm sorry. I want to try. She was waiting at the spaceport when his shuttle landed. Sarah Carmichael looked like her mother, same eyes, same determined set to her jaw. She was crying when she saw him, and so was he. I'm so sorry, Neil said, the words tumbling out. I'm sorry I left. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I chose loneliness over being your father. Sarah hugged him tightly. I know. I read the reports from Unity Prime. I know what happened, what you've been dealing with. But Dad, you taught an entire civilization how to be individuals. Maybe now you can teach yourself how to be connected again. They talked for hours at a small cafe near the spaceport. Neil told her about the Unity, about the collapse of the Hive mind, about Lyris and Guardian, and the painful birth of a new civilization. Sarah told him about her life, the things he'd missed, her graduation, her marriage, the grandchild he didn't know he had. I want to meet them, Neil said. I want to be part of your life again, if you'll let me. I never stopped wanting you to be part of my life, Sarah said. I just needed you to want it too. That evening, Neil stood in Sarah's home holding his granddaughter for the first time. The baby looked up at him with curious eyes, and Neil felt something break open in his chest. This was connection. This was what he'd been running from. Not the pain of loss, but the terrifying vulnerability of love. His communication device chimed, a message from Lyris, sent across light years from Unity Prime. I hope you are finding your way back to connection. We are finding ours. Thank you for showing us that consciousness is not about being together or alone, but about having the choice and the courage to choose honestly. Neil looked at his granddaughter, at Sarah, watching them both with wet eyes, at the home full of life he'd almost thrown away. He thought about the Unity, scattered across their worlds, each one making their own choices about how to exist. Some merged, some stayed individual. Most fluctuated between the two, learning to balance connection and autonomy. He'd given the Unity individual consciousness, and they'd taught him that individual consciousness was meaningless without connection to make it matter. They'd learned from each other, two species struggling with the same fundamental questions. How do we exist? How do we connect? How do we find meaning in the space between isolation and unity? There were no perfect answers, but there were choices, made daily, moment by moment, to reach out across the void between consciousnesses and try to build bridges. Sometimes the bridges held, sometimes they collapsed. But the trying, the reaching, the hoping that connection was possible even when it was terrifying, that was what made consciousness worth having. Neil looked at Lyris's message again and typed a reply. I'm learning. We're all learning. Thank you for reminding me that being alone and being lonely are different things, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose to be vulnerable enough to connect. Outside, the sky filled with stars. Somewhere, among them, the Unity was rebuilding their civilization in ways they never could have imagined as a collective. And here on Earth, Neil Carmichael was rebuilding his life in ways he never could have imagined in his self-imposed isolation. Both species were learning the same lesson. Consciousness wasn't the destination. It was the journey, messy and painful and beautiful, toward understanding what it meant to be alive.